If you've ever had a long conversation with the AI chatbot and noticed that it starts to kind of lose the plot, forget things that you said earlier, or start to contradict itself, that's likely because of these two issues we're going to be talking about, tokens and context windows. So if you remember from lesson number 3, we learned that large language models are basically just a prediction machine. It's going to read what came before and predict what should come next, one piece at a time. And then in the previous lesson, we learned about hallucinations and how that prediction process can go wrong. And so today we'll go one level deeper and figure out why these concepts of tokens and context windows affect how your AI is functioning. So the first thing to understand is that these large language models, they're not seeing words, they're seeing tokens. And like we've talked about before, a token is basically just a chunk of text. Sometimes it can be a whole word, depending on how big the word is. Sometimes it's a part of a word. Sometimes it's a piece of punctuation, a space, or just a small fragment. So even this sentence, it might be 3 tokens. Now, this isn't always the case, but generally speaking in English, the convention is that 1 token is about 3/4 of a word, obviously depending on how big that word is. So it is quite variable. So just remember that when you're talking to one of these AIs or inputting information, it's going to first break it down into tokens to actually understand what's going on before giving you that output. And then the model is going to predict, like we've talked about before, 1 token at a time for the response, and then it's going to give you its answers. This is why when you sign up for these frontier model subscriptions, it talks about AI usage or set limits, and these are counted in tokens, input or output tokens, and now you understand what that means. Now, the other concept is context windows. This is the maximum number of tokens that the model can consider at one time. So if you think of it like a desk, everything that the model is paying attention to has to physically fit on that desk. Your question, the conversation so far, any documents that you've attached, and the response that it's writing. All of that has to fit within the context window. So if that context window fills up and something new is put in, something else has to be removed. So remember, the model doesn't have memory the way you and I do or humans do. Remember, like we talked about before, these AI models learn during their training on the data that they're trained on, and then that learning is frozen. Whereas when we learn new information, we remember it moving forward. When you chat with an AI, the model itself is not learning anything about you or permanently storing your conversations. All of that functionality that you see is agentic work on top of the model, but here we're just strictly talking about the large language model itself. So every time you send it a message, the application is building a new prompt for that model, and that's going to include the context of recent conversation, any instructions that you've set, any documents that it retrieves, or any memories that it's purposefully been set to memorize. So every time that prompt is sent to the model, the answer it's going to give you is based on whatever data is available in that context window. It's not remembering your conversation, it's just rereading the context that it was given. Now, these days, obviously with ChatGPT and Claude, they do have separate memory functions that do store facts about you across chats, but that's different from the context window. It's something that's an additional feature rather than being integrated into the LLM. So now what happens when that desk or that context window fills up? Well, that's what explains the weird behavior you sometimes see the longer you go in one chat. The latest models can support context windows from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of tokens, depending on the model, and that usually should be enough for the average person's use. But it's not infinite, and the performance is going to start to degrade even before you hit that limit. So when a conversation gets very long, older messages might be trimmed away, summarized, or replaced with a shorter version so that the model can still fit some information that was older into its context window, but it's not going to be the original conversation. And there is something called the lost in the middle problem, where researchers have found that models are usually best at using the information near the beginning and the end of the context, and stuff in the middle can often get lost. Now, if you remember back to our lesson on hallucinations, when that middle part or some important context is missing, the model's not going to stop and say that, hey, I can't see this part of the conversation anymore. It's just going to fill the gap with whatever continuation it thinks is most plausible. And that's one of the ways the hallucinations happens, is that the model is trying to answer you, but its context window is limited because it's lost that older information just because it can't hang on to so much. So it's basically completing a story that it can only partially see. And this is why these tools often have message limits and why longer conversations cost more for those companies to run. Every response requires that model to process the context again. So the longer your conversation goes, it has to go back and process lots of earlier exchanges every time you sent a new message. And that's why it takes a lot of computing power, and that's why the quality of the responses starts to deteriorate. And just making a context window bigger isn't necessarily better because it still has to sort through all that information and decipher what's important. So be careful when you're prompting to give it the information that it needs to give you the best answer possible, but don't overfill it with a bunch of stuff that it has to process through, because that's going to increase the likelihood that it gives you a poor answer or just a straight up hallucination. So there's a few ways to work with that limitation of the context window in mind. You can start new chats for new topics. Everything unrelated to a current conversation that you're having is just going to be clutter on the desk. A clean new chat kind of gives you a reset, especially if you're talking about an unrelated topic to a different chat. You want to front load your information, so that initial prompt, make it detailed, give it all the information you think it needs, rather than waiting for it to reply and just having a conversation back and forth, giving more information piece by piece. Another thing you can do if you notice that a conversation has gone on long and the responses are starting to deteriorate, just ask that particular chat to summarize the conversation so far, take what it gives you, and then start a new chat. Now, a lot of these problems are going to be solved by the companies themselves as these models improve, but it's just something to keep in mind that if you're noticing that the answers you're getting are not very good or unreliable, it might be because that context window is just fried, and you should keep that in mind when you're asking questions or using AI for whatever you're using it for. It does have its limitations, and as always, be sure to verify information on your own. By the time it answers you, or if you're late in chat, it might have forgotten earlier context or it slipped out of that context window. So whatever it's telling you might not even be true. But essentially, these two topics of tokens and context window are very important to understand to optimize your use of AI. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Check out the resources and the newsletter, as well as the community in the description. We're working on some cool stuff there, and it's all free for now. Let us know what you want to hear about next, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.